Yeah.
Good afternoon. I hope everybody's doing well. Welcome to Faculty Welfare and Development Committee showcase at Penfield College, Mercer University. Showcase of sabbaticals that were completed by Dr. Don Redmond, Dr. Melanie Pavich, and Dr. Charles Roberts. We have our first presenter, who is going to be our first presenter is Dr. Don Redmond. He is He's the Associate Professor of Counseling for the Department of Counseling. And a little bit of background, he did his undergraduate at the University of North Carolina, which he is very proud of, and his master's. And he did his PhD at the University of Virginia. He's been a faculty member here at Mercer for a while and is also over the Narrative Center that is located in Penfield College. Without further ado, we will bring him up to do a presentation entitled A Proposal for Certificate in Narrative Studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. William. Okay, first of all, to those of you here in the room, and especially to anyone who might be watching and or now and or watch this later, I want to thank our faculty of the counseling department for supporting me in this, both in getting approved and in taking care of some of my responsibilities while I was on sabbatical. And our dean, Dr. Dan Heiser, and our provost and president and board of directors for giving all of us the opportunity for a sabbatical. I wasn't sure exactly what it would mean until I actually got into it, but it's been incredibly beneficial for both renewal and also I feel just a chance to read and produce, and I hope that I've produced something that will pay dividends both for me personally and professionally, but also for Mercer going forward. So my proposal is for a certificate in narrative studies, and before getting into some of the specifics, I wanted to share a couple short stories about how I came to be in this position to present this proposal. And it starts with my idea for a study abroad program. So the study abroad originally was for narrative therapy, and this is related to the counseling field. And in our discipline, we look for different theoretical orientations to basically be able to help folks gain more meaning in their lives and overcome different problems that they encounter. So in doing the narrative therapy study abroad, it started to occur to me that the field of narrative very much lends itself to interdisciplinary study, and because of that, I decided to open up the course topic to not just narrative therapy, but as I've termed the course, narrative theory. So that allows me and our students to look at more of a broader perspective on narrative theory and how that informs both narrative therapy and our larger appreciation for stories in the world. So based on that, I came up with the idea for an interdisciplinary narrative center and was very fortunate to receive funding from the Georgia Compassion Project, and after many meetings and presentations, I was given the green light to go ahead and start our Narrative Center toward the end of 2013. Okay. Before I get to this slide, if you'll notice on this slide, this is our official boilerplate for the Center for the Study of Narrative. And as I've discovered in many different areas, that there are very specific and helpful guidelines for us as we hopefully build a brand of Mercer, while also adding hopefully a creative element to what we're doing. So I first came up with the idea of kind of a guiding motto, and that led to what is the Center for Study of Narrative. So this is our official boilerplate logo. But before that, we came up with this logo, but more importantly to me, it's these three words on the bottom, and they are compassion, insight, and movement. So the idea is we look for faculty and students that have compassion and also a passion for a certain topic, and with that topic we hope to gain insight by listening to others, listening to the stories of others. And this has been, so far at least, we've heard a very wide range of individuals and different experiences they've been through. And then the last part, movement, I feel now as though we're moving toward where we're starting to develop a library, and we're starting to develop knowledge. So now we are also into the movement, where we're hopefully sharing what we're learning with others. So, a certificate in narrative studies. Why would we want to have a certificate? And if so, should it be for credit or not for credit? These are a few of the things that I had to answer even when I put together the proposal for the sabbatical to get the approval to hopefully pursue a certificate in narrative studies at Penfield. There are certainly many excellent for-credit proposals, but there are a couple different reasons why I am presenting a non-credit certificate proposal. One is that this is geared toward graduate students. So it means that a student is either already in a graduate program or they're in a doctoral program and have graduated with a master's. So because of the time and financial resources that go into that, I thought it made more sense to have it be a little bit smaller in scope to make it more available and appealing to a wider range of individuals. So based on that and my own experience at Mercer teaching in various certificate programs, I made the decision to propose something that is not for credit. So in doing that, the first step, I tried to do this as strategically as I could, and the first step for me was doing research on exactly what programs are out there in this area. There are certainly a lot of certificate programs, but in our area, not that many in narrative studies, and both from an academic standpoint and even a geographic standpoint, there are not that many of them. And as far as I know, this will be the first one, at least in the southeastern United States. So I have a chart up here, and I have a couple other charts, and I apologize that it might be a little small for folks in here to see, so I'm just going to do a quick overview. So these are certificate programs, either at universities or at centers that are specifically for more practice areas. So Center for Narrative Practice, which is in Boston, the Dulwich Center in Adelaide and Melbourne, Australia, Ohio State University, Columbia University, and then the Center for Narrative Studies, which is in Washington, D.C. And in looking at these programs, and there are a couple others that, and I should mention those real quick, two others in particular that really inspired me to attempt to start our narrative center at Mercer in Atlanta. One is the Center for the Study of Lives at Northwestern, and the other is the Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Narrative, which is at St. Thomas University in New Brunswick, Canada. And the reason those aren't on here is because they don't offer certificate programs, but they were very influential in my idea for starting our narrative center. So these are ones that actually do offer either a certificate or a 4-credit program. And the one that's probably most known is the one at Columbia University, and that's in narrative medicine. So they have a certificate program, and they now are one of the first universities in the country to have a 2-year master's program in narrative medicine, which has some of the same areas of focus is the one that I hope that we'll have, and certainly it's one of the ones that informed my proposal. And over on the right, I've showed the cost and the amount of time it takes, and that also has led me to, it informed my budgeting. And as I've done this, and I've done pro formas before, I've set up a budget, but with the pro forma, it's not the same as when we would need to actually have other faculty. It's more about the amount of students that we would need in order to fund the certificate program each year. And I have that information here with me today, but I don't think we're going to have time for me to get to it. But if with questions, if you are curious about that, I can also discuss that. So out of all of these, as I started thinking about, okay, how can we formulate the certificate program, there was one that really jumped out at me. And it was the one in Boston, the Center for Narrative Practice. And a couple reasons that jumped out at me. One is that I really like the fact that it was done during a calendar year. I'm going to go ahead and jump to the schedule for our proposed narrative certificate program. So it was done, there was what is called an intensive residency program. So one thing I did not want to do is have this be just online. I would actually be okay with it being completely in person, but that didn't necessarily seem practical either. But this proposal, so it's based on an academic year, and I know, having worked with some other certificate programs, one of the difficult aspects has been, not knowing from an academic calendar standpoint when it would be offered. So the way this is set up is that it would be offered, the first intensive on-campus portion would be offered late in the fall, December hopefully. Then that would be the first 2 modules. Then in the middle, 3 and 4, would be during the spring, and those would be online, and hopefully that would give students an opportunity to have already bonded and had a good experience on campus, so that hopefully that would add to the experience of online. And we've had some discussions recently, and I know Arla has shared some interesting research and literature about how hybrid is appealing to students maybe in ways that both in person and completely online do not. So I had that in mind also putting this together, that if we could get folks on campus and could meet faculty and have an experience on campus, and they would already know their fellow students, I think that could really enrich their experience with the online, which is basically sandwiched between two intensive on-campus experiences. So this is the on-campus, online, and then the last two, 5 and 6, is May, and that's on campus as well. So this would give us an opportunity to have, to know it's done during one academic year, and then have an opportunity to do a graduation ceremony in May. Another benefit of this is that students, if they're in a current graduate program, whether it's at Mercer or anywhere around Atlanta or anywhere else, they still would have the opportunity to attend the intensive on campus because they would have already finished their semester responsibilities. And of course that also relates to why it would be better for faculty to do the intensive on campus, because it wouldn't be in the middle of our grading or in the middle of our semester schedule. Okay. What I'm doing now, this is the entire tentative schedule, and so I've broken that down. Now I'm going to briefly discuss each module. Very brief. Give it time. So this is the first module, and it would take place, and I have this for this year. My original plan and goal was to implement this as soon as possible. So based on the calendar and where we're at right now, I don't know if that's possible, but I'm still holding out hope that we might be able to get this through in the fall in time to actually start. But the first program would be a weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday in December, and then the following Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So if someone was coming from out of town and they needed to take off from work, that would give them the opportunity to do both of these, but only miss 7 days of work. And that might be a little ambitious, but several of these programs I noticed that particularly that there does seem to be such interest around narrative studies that folks really are willing to travel even internationally to do some of these programs. So I wanted to at least think about that when I was designing it. So the first part is mainly an introduction to narrative, and then what it is, the interdisciplinary nature, how it relates to what we consider qualitative inquiry. And the second module is titled Narrative Care, and this is the portion of the proposal that probably most specifically addresses my background in counseling. And it's not only covering what narrative therapy is, but also the idea of narrative gerontology, and as Dan McAdams, the Center for the Study of Lives, writes about there's an intervention now called the life story interview, which is similar to some of the things that we've already done with doing narrative interviewing. The third and fourth, thinking about narrative from an interpersonal and even intrapersonal level. Again, helping folks look about how stories have impacted their life and how they construct their own life stories. And then moving out a little bit further with the environment, our cultural milieu in the region that we're in the U.S., and to a certain extent the global community. And also social media, social justice, and social justice is something I wanted to comment on briefly as well. Our field of counseling, we actually have an ethical code and specific statements in our code of ethics that we are obligated to pursue what we would consider social justice. So I think it's important when we, really when we teach and when we, certainly if we're doing something like this, I don't think the idea shouldn't be to promote a certain political agenda. But I'll also say that just from a social justice standpoint, and related to narrative, some of the idea of narrative studies and interventions, it's about getting stories that have been oppressed or suppressed, and for a variety of different reasons, whether it's politically or other reasons, but often it's politically and power structure. Because of that, I think it's naturally going to be drawn to what we might think of as a more progressive ideology, but that is certainly not the main intent. Narrative in the arts. This is a module that really has been influenced, especially by my study abroad experience. And I mentioned initially that it was a narrative therapy class, and then it's evolved into narrative theory. And one of the ways that has evolved, for example, is considering how the concept of narrative can actually present itself in a lot of different artistic environments. For example, the students, one of their, they've got two different assignments related to art specifically. One is Vincent van Gogh and the museum, Van Gogh Museum that the students go to. It is set up as though you're walking through his life biographically and chronologically, which is really interesting. And then we also go to the Louvre, and their assignment is to find a work of art that speaks to them in a way that they connect with in their own life, and then write about the story of their life and how that connects to what they're seeing in a work of art. So I think that's a nice way to really highlight that narrative can be about the arts and popular culture, and not just something that we think of as more theoretical. And then the last module, it says narrative synthesis, but bringing all of this together, the previous modules, and also what I'm calling a capstone project for the participants, where they can think about their own life stories so far, bring into that story from a career standpoint. How is their career track up to that point? How might that be described in terms of the story, using digital storytelling as part of that project? And then I have here narrative and career and social construction. That there's a part of our field within career counseling that's called career constructivism, and that very much pertains, I think, to narrative interviewing, and the idea is trying to make a story out of your career and how that also might inform your future career goals and growth. questions or comment or suggestions in anything that you're not sure about, or ways that you might think this could be enhanced.
Any questions?
Don, when's your projected sort of time frame to actually start this certificate?
So the question was, what is Dr. Redmond's projected time frame for this project?
My hope is to start this December, and that's been my plan.
Okay, so this, as you had listed.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. So if it's not this December, at least by December 2019.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
Can you go back to the schedule? Sure. It's still on an 8-week schedule.
It's not.
9, okay.
it's a
Yeah.
semester, isn't it?
No, it's, and that's one of the things that's a little bit different, and I would say based on what we're used to, even a little bit radical, but it's more intensive, and that's the intensive residency part. So individuals would come in and whether it's either Thursday night, Friday and Saturday, or Friday night, Saturday and Sunday, it would be intensive for that weekend. Then they would have an assignment, and then the second module would start the following Thursday or Friday. So they would finish the first third of it within 2 weeks of starting.
Oh,
And then would you, I'm so sorry, I was slow.
That's okay.
I'm slow. Would you have preparation that they would need to come the first night?
Yes.
Done, read, said?
Yes.
Okay, great.
And yes, and an assignment that would be due at the beginning of the second
Yeah.
module.
We're checking to see if there's some questions from people on WebEx.
Hey, Laurie,
Okay.
can you hear me?
Oh, otherwise.
I think that's the dean.
So not used to having that.
Priscilla, good morning. Good afternoon.
Switch
Dean, can you hear us?
I think the issue was, they're evidently, he can't hear them. They can hear us, but we can't hear them.
So we can't get them
I don't
to
know.
ask questions.
Well, because they're asking, but we can't.
We can't.
And,
All they need to do is unmute themselves. I just unmuted. Dean, can you hear us now?
They can hear us, but they can't speak back.
And he said that if they stood on the side of the webcam as opposed to in front of it, all they're getting is like the back or body of, yeah.
Okay.
That's my best side.
Thank you, sorry to.
No, we appreciate it.
Yeah, he's-
Do you think that it would be better to give them that phone number there? Could you email them that phone number?
I can send
And that
it
way
to
we
them.
can just have them on the phone over there.
Yeah, because, that's why I come in and texted, I thought that they were on the phone, so they're doing it through the web.
They're doing it through the WebEx, and that's what we're having the problems, it sounds like.
Yeah, if, they may need, just from experience, they may need a headset, because depending on which computer they're on, it might not have the microphone compatibility.
Right.
So I know when I do it with one of my IT classes, I have to use my headset.
Yeah.
But I'll let them know to
Yeah.
call that.
If you can give them that, and then we can just patch them in.
Definitely.
Thank
Sorry
you.
to interrupt y'all.
No, you're fine.
Okay, Charles, can you hear us? Okay, I mean, your voice is like really low. Let me put it up. Can you talk now, please?
I swear I can hear him a little bit.
Mhm.
Charles, try now. Charles, try now, please.
Yes, this is Charles.
Oh,
Great, we can hear you now.
Oh, good. I was about to call in. Okay, I'll hang up.
Do you have any questions for
No, I
Don?
didn't. I was most of the occupied was trying to get this. I was the one that called Tammy and stuff.
Okay, we appreciate you communicating that so we can get you all plugged in.
Is he going
Oh
to?
no, I didn't have any questions. Is Priscilla still with us?
Kevin.
Charles, we could see Laurie signed in, but I don't see Jadine there.
She was there because we were talking to each other for a while. You all couldn't hear her. Okay. Tammy is calling me now. Hello, Tammy? Yeah, I already, yes, I had that number, but they finally got this way now. They can hear. That,
Who's going to talk?
Yeah.
Melody, do you have a PowerPoint?
Can I have a tutorial later, Don, some other day?
Sure,
See the beginning part? It looks wonderful.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Redmond. I know the faculty will look forward to seeing that presentation put on once we edit the video and get it out to the public. Looks like a very strong program, and you're very productive during your sabbatical. Hello, how you doing, Dean?
Oh, they called me Laurie. Okay. I was hearing you all, and Charles was hearing you all, but we could not participate.
We fixed it.
You couldn't hear us, so sorry. I heard Don's presentation, though.
Oh, good, good. Did you have any questions?
I did have one, and that was, but just something to think of down the road, and that is, if you wanted to go with a 4-course, 4-credit certificate or something, my question was, would do the master's level students and doctoral level students have enough electives available to them so that they could get credit for it, graduate credit for it, while they were taking it? That's all.
Great question. I think it could be a nice complement to the cognate for our doctoral students. I'm not sure as much about the master's students in terms of the 4-credit part.
That was my only thing because, non-credit will be relatively easy to do, but sometimes the students like, they may want to fashion a cognate or elective around it, so they're killing 2 birds with 1 stone. They got to have the electives anyway or the cognate, and then if they can take away a credit-bearing Mercer University certificate, that might be something, that might be more attractive to them. That was the only thought.
Those are great points. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. Okay, Again, thank you, Dr. Redmond, for your presentation. We're going to go to the next presenter, Dr. Melanie Pavich, Associate Professor of Interdisciplinary and Historical Studies, College Writing Coordinator in the Department of Liberal Studies. And she's in the Department of Liberal
Want to
Studies.
stand there?
She now will be coming up to present.
Okay. And you can use that desk if you
Okay, I also wanted to give my thanks, as did Don, to the department and to Dean Danheiser, to the provost, president, and to the board of trustees for this sabbatical time. It was, as Don said, his was productive and really worthwhile in terms of feeling renewed, having a chance. Probably for me, the greatest gift was being able to take time to read in a way that's not possible when you're teaching and doing everything else. So that was a great gift, and I did a lot of reading. And my sabbatical research was focused on editing a book manuscript, which is actually my doctoral dissertation, and being able to sort of catch up on the scholarship that had happened in the interim. I finished in 2010, so in the last 8 years to look at what's been written since then and to see if I needed to reorient or to change in any major way or even a minor way what I had already written. So basically the reading that I did in fact supported more or less what I had written with some additions. And so this work is focused on a woman who was born in 1839. Her name was Martha Fell Schofield, and she died in 1916. She was a Quaker born outside and lived until she was about 22 outside of Philadelphia. She came from a very, very, very progressive family of abolitionists and women's rights supporters, and her mother was a recommended minister, Quaker minister, which was somewhat unusual for the time, which meant that she could preach not only in her own meeting, but in other meetings. She traveled and did preaching, but also supported abolition. Went as far south, I think, as Maryland, and as far north as New York, on a kind of circuit. Martha herself was a teacher, as were her sisters, before she became what is referred to among historians and others as a freedmen's teacher. So in 1865, at the end of the Civil War, she came south to coastal South Carolina to take up black education. This work came out of research I was doing for my major professor at UGA. He has done a seminal book on freedmen's teachers. And so I was a research assistant for him for 4 years and met Martha through my research that went towards his book. So Martha Schofield left 12 diaries that are part of a collection that I was able to read. And I decided, when I went to grad school, when I started at UGA, I actually had an entirely different idea of what my dissertation was going to be, and had gotten through my qualifying exams and was getting ready to write my proposal for my dissertation when I switched gears and decided, once I had met Martha, and decided that I really wanted to focus on her and to write about her. Now, I wasn't interested in writing about her as a freedmen's teacher per se. Having read her diaries, I was much more interested in focusing on how she became the woman she became. So this is really a story of what we can learn from her diaries about really her emotional life, about how is it that she became this person who didn't take the normal route of women of her time, the more traditional route of marrying and having children, but in fact became not only a teacher, but eventually opened a school for African Americans in Aiken, South Carolina, and made that her life's work. She was an institution builder, she was a marketer, she was a brilliant teacher, And she fought against racism for all of her adult life. She was put in harm's way in South Carolina. She had the Klan and other terrorists on her doorstep at her house more than once. And each time it happened, she was able to sort of talk them out of burning her house at one point. She was an amazing marketer, and I mean, really did on her own get people outside of the South, because at the time, Southerners in large part weren't going to support African American education. But she managed to grow what became the Schofield Normal and Industrial School into a boarding school, one of the few for blacks in the South, and to make it successful, certainly until her death, and then for some years after that. So I'm going to read a little bit so you can get to know her, and maybe come to understand why I feel as attached to her as I do, and as passionate about telling her story as I do. So these are some parts of what I have rewritten since I started this sabbatical. So on March 31st, 1862, Martha Schofield wrote in her diary, "I can bear much when I feel that I am doing right, for that is the great end of, or rather the beginning of true life." Her entry exemplifies the independence she had come to desire and the means by which to justify it. As long as she was convinced of the rightness of her actions, Martha would tolerate the disapproval or even censure of others. She was a young woman who pushed the boundaries of a woman's place at a time when those boundaries were in flux and less clear than they had been in the past. The necessities of the war brought new opportunities for work and service. However, when the Civil War ended, she did not return as others did to more traditional female roles. Instead, as a freedmen's teacher, Martha Schofield joined the ranks of the more than 11,000 women and men who chose to aid former slaves in their transition from bondage to freedom. For 12 years, beginning on January 1st, 1858, and ending on January 1st, 1870, Martha wrote in her diary nearly every day. Yet her ritual of writing came to serve as much more than an account of daily events or as an emotional outlet, though it served both of these. It became a foundation from which to build a life of accomplishment and independence. In her diary, she narrated, and we can follow the path she took in defining and claiming a life of her own design, an autonomous life. Central to the unfolding of that life was the world of her emotions. Martha Fell Schofield was born on February 1st, 1839, into a family of Hicksite Quakers in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Her parents, Oliver and Mary Jackson Schofield, were among the most radical reformers of the time, supporting abolition, temperance, and the expansion of rights of women. Their circle of friends included Lucretia and James Mott, William Lloyd Garrison, and Susan B. Anthony, among other notable women and men. The Schofield children were in birth order twins, Sarah Jane and Lydia, born in 1835, Benjamin, born in 1837, Martha, born in 1839, and Eliza, born in 1840. They were overall a close-knit family, an affectionate family. Martha and her siblings seemed to especially relish their father's open and easy temperament, and it was a particularly severe blow when Oliver Schofield died in 1852. Moreover, Benjamin was then separated from the family, choosing to live with an aunt and uncle, rather than leave the family farm with his mother and sisters. So this was, as you can imagine, her father died, and her mother was unable with younger children to keep the farm running. And so rather than move into Derby, into town, into a smaller home, the brother Benjamin decided not to move with the family, and was really ever after separated from them. They would visit, but he never really lived with them again. The Schofield children also grew up among a large extended family of Schofields and Jacksons, and within several Quaker communities. Martha received her education at home with a tutor, in public school, and for a short time at the Sheridan Female Institute established by her uncle John Jackson. Martha and her sisters all worked as teachers, though her youngest sister Eliza concentrated her efforts more steadily on her artistic talents. She actually became an artist and went and studied in Europe for a time. Only one of the four sisters married, and that was Sally. Lydia, Sally's twin, often lived with Sally and her husband to assist with housekeeping and eventually childcare. This is another thing that sort of often happened in families, that unmarried sisters might then go and live with a married sister to help with housekeeping. Martha was 22 years old when the first shots were fired on Fort Sumter and had by then spent 4 years teaching in New York and Pennsylvania. She was, of all the Schofield sisters, the one who felt a real calling to teach, and during the war taught in a school for free blacks in Philadelphia. Like many other young women of the time, she also took up hospital work and nursing. So the fact that Martha Schofield worked in a black school in Philadelphia, even coming from as progressive a family as she did, was considered a very radical thing to do. And as I will say later, often when she made decisions to do things like work in teach in a black school in Philadelphia, or to become a freedmen's teacher, she never let anybody know in the family that's what she was doing. She sort of, after the fact, came to them and said, I've already gotten a job, I'm going. So that they, because her parents, by then her mother had remarried, didn't approve of her either teaching in this school in Philadelphia or going south initially to teach. Mary Jackson Schofield, Martha's mother, was a role model for her daughters and revered by them. Again, she was a Quaker minister. She often traveled to preach or to speak in support of abolition. Consequently, she understood well the difficulty of managing a life of service without a marriage and motherhood. In 1850, after having been away from home for more than a week, Martha's mother, Mary, felt a personal need to leave her family still longer in order to have time alone to rest. She left her husband in charge of the house and children. They agreed she was doing what was best for her and therefore for their family. Again, this is a really radical thing to do for a man, a father at this point in time, to sort of say, I'll stay home with the kids while you go off and rest for a while.
Yeah.
Theirs was a marriage, Mary Schofield and her husband Aller, not unlike that of Lucretia and James Mott. Anne M. Spiker has written of the Mott's marriage that James Mott seemed to view his whole role as primarily of one to support his wife's activism, and she was able to remain extraordinarily active because of the support she received from him. Martha wrote in her diary often wrote of feeling misunderstood by her mother, and was at times conflicted because of the intensity of her desire for a life of action. She struggled with how far she was willing to push the boundaries of obedience and even propriety to achieve her goals. Her mother always agreed to her plans whether to teach or nurse, though often reluctantly, or was preempted from any input when Martha went ahead secretly. Her mother's life, though radical in terms of politics and religions, fell within the more traditional sphere of marriage and motherhood. What is clear in Martha's writing during this period is her desire for a life outside the bonds of marriage. Yet in her diary, she often wrote of love, romantic and platonic, and continued to wonder at the possibilities of marriage and motherhood. Martha Schofield's choice of a life as a teacher of free men and women in South Carolina was in part a result of the expansion of opportunities afforded women during the Civil War. However, women of Martha's region and class were already laying claim to lives of labor and service that did not include marriage and dependence. Lee Virginia Chambers Schiller identified an antebellum cult of single blessedness, in which, quote, women began to think of themselves as individuals with their own identities, roles, rights, and callings separate from those of kin, church, or community, and defined by personal needs and desires, not the prescriptions of gender. Women began to express the very human desire to grow, to accomplish, to succeed. They acknowledged ambition, valued independence, and sought autonomy. They wanted to make their own choices, to be responsible for their own achievements and failures, to establish their own priorities and to enact them. Schiller studied more than 100 women in New England between 1780 and 1840, but women in the South also sought alternatives to marriage. In Southern single blessedness, Christine Jacobson Carter defined a similar ideology that held that it was better to remain single and devote one's life to service to others, especially within one's own family, than to marry the wrong man for the wrong reason. There were few vocational or professional opportunities for women of standing in the South. However, in the North, single blessedness allowed new avenues for education, vocation, autonomy, and intimacy outside marriage, as it elevated the unmarried state as one of purity, disinterest, and service. Seeking liberty, which was to them a better husband, unmarried Northern women struggled against the constraints and obligations family members made of them, looking instead for economic security, rooms of their own, and expanded intellectual horizons. This is an apt description of the trajectory of Martha Schofield's life to the point of her departure for the South in 1865. Though she had not dismissed the idea that she would someday marry, she postponed that decision, seeking the liberty of a vocation that would provide her with a sense of accomplishment and an opportunity to serve her country. As she wrote to Oliver Johnson of the Anti-Slavery Association of New York City, "The spirit within me will not rest while there is so much need to work. I frequently see how much teachers are needed, and I am willing to give time, labor, life if need be, in the cause, and only ask from our government enough to meet the necessities of life, and if my own purse would meet the demand." Martha's role models were drawn not just from her generation, but from the generation of her mother, from women she knew and those she read about or heard speak. Lucretia Mott was not only a close friend of Martha's mother, but a mentor to Martha as well. She wrote in 1863, after hearing Mott speak at quarterly meeting, "I love her so much. She is so meek, and yet moves steadily on speaking for the right and the shirking the wrong." Angelina and Sarah Grimke, while not personal friends, were among the older women who set an example of lives dedicated to the cause of freedom, but also of lives lived on their own terms. The Grimkes renounced their slave-owning past, became Quakers, and joined a small group of women who became abolitionist lecturers. They not only advocated a controversial and generally unpopular political cause, but elected to do so in an unconventional, unfeminine way, speaking in public to mixed or promiscuous, as it was termed then, audiences. While Lucretia Mott spoke most often to groups of Quakers, she too endured opposition to her preaching ministry. Again, it's hard for us to understand how radical it was for women to speak in front of audiences of men and women. They were accused of being, no less than prostitutes for doing that. So these women, Martha never did this, but in terms of those women who she talked about in her diaries, who she referred to, not necessarily strictly as role models, she didn't say role models, but still they were role models for her. During the war, other women closer to Martha's age were serving as nurses in hospitals and at the front, including Clara Barton, Louisa May Alcott, both of whom Martha mentioned in her diaries. However, the woman whose influence on her seemed the greatest was Anna E. Dickinson. From a Philadelphia Quaker family, Dickinson began her speaking career in 1860 after attending the annual meeting of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society and delivering an impromptu but stirring speech. She was encouraged by Lucretia Mott and others to begin a career as a public lecturer and drew large crowds speaking against slavery and in support of women's rights, as well as equal rights for all citizens. She was one of the greatest celebrities of her time. Interesting always to me when I hear things like that or learn things like that is this is a name that most of us have never heard. Martha first heard Dickinson in November 1860 and wrote with great enthusiasm that her, quote, earnest words fell from her lips as though she was inspired by God. She is working in a noble cause, and never can the impression of that young being pleading so beautifully for one half of the human race be driven from my memory, end quote. 4 years later, in the summer of 1864, Martha heard Dickinson speak again. She wrote then, quote, only once in a century or more is woman called to so great a work, and never in the history of our nation has a young woman had such a mission. Martha continued, we must remember that times like these demand of each of us every effort in the great cause, and because her powers and responsibilities lead her out of the common path, we have no right to condemn so long as they only produce good. There is something sublime and heroic in a young woman thus stepping out of her supposed sphere and bearing the criticism of the nation for the good of her country. Given the work that Martha was about to enter into, she was surely speaking of herself as much as she was of Anna Dickinson. Over the past 30 years, historians have taken on the world of emotion in their studies, especially as they explored the private lives of women. Works such as Carol Smith Rosenberg's The Female World of Love and Ritual, Relations Between Women in the 19th Century, and she argued that women derived their greatest sense of love and understanding from their relationships with other women rather than from their relationships with men. Though rooted in quote, the ideology of separate spheres introduced by Barbara Welter in her article, The Cult of True Womanhood, Smith Rosenberg moved the discussion of women's lives from the realm of victimization in an oppressive social system to one that emphasized distinctly female values, such as mutuality and nurture. Both Ellen K. Rothman in Hands and Hearts, A History of Courtship in America, and Karen Lystra in Searching the Heart, Women, Men, and Romantic Love in 19th Century America, challenged the belief that gendered spheres made real intimacy between the sexes all but impossible, or were the only means by which women experienced intimate sharing in their fullest emotional expression. On the contrary, both found ample evidence in primary sources of surprisingly open discussions among couples about love, in a few cases about sex, and a blurring of sex role distinction. As Karen Lystra writes, while 19th century American culture has been characterized by the extreme separation of masculine and feminine spheres, it should also be described as a century in which sex role distinctions were beginning to blur. A fully drawn history of Victorian sex roles demands paradoxical recognition of both the rigidity and fluidity of the division and overlap of gender lines. Others, too, have challenged the extent to which the ideology of separate spheres reflected the reality of middle and upper-class women's lives. Laurie Ginsberg argues that the reality of women's lives was quite different from the ideology which they themselves used. Such was the case for Martha. She wrote with approval of Anna Dickinson of the heroism of a young woman stepping outside her sphere to serve a great cause, and at the same time that she would not want her sister or a close friend to appear in public. Yet she did not include herself in that stricture. Martha wrote that God intended women for marriage and motherhood, while she lived a life that tested the limits of a woman's sphere. Martha Schofield was a deeply passionate and sensitive woman. Throughout her diaries is evidence of her attachment to friends and a search for love. Her relationships with women were close and affectionate, and she enjoyed a sense that she often served them as advisor and confidant. Her bonds with women were essential to her happiness and well-being. However, her relationships with men were far more complicated. In all her closest friendships, Martha's desire was for deep emotional connection and intimacy. While the intimacy of women was not only sanctioned but expected, with the exception of siblings and engaged couples or soon-to-be engaged, women and men were expected to maintain a proper emotional and physical distance. More than once, Martha pushed this boundary almost to the point of breaking. In addition, she was romantically linked with two men, and both were married. Like most women of her time, she did not write openly of her relationships with men in terms of their physical aspects. Moreover, she deliberately excised portions of her diaries and burned or otherwise disposed of many letters. 2 entire diaries are missing for this period and were likely destroyed by her, yet enough evidence remains to offer clues to these vital relationships. As hidden transcript, Martha's diaries functioned as one of the few places where she could get in touch with and develop hidden parts of herself, often those aspects of which little support was given by others. And she established emotional stability and independence in part through her diaries, through writing these diaries and keeping them for so long. They were a place of safety where new roles and ideas could be tested, a sounding board for ideas or emotions that might not have been acceptable to friends or family. Not only was Martha subject to the power of the patriarchal social structure in which she lived, but also the power of her family, who often openly questioned or opposed the decisions she made about her work as well as her personal life. Unlike other 19th century diarists, her personal writing was not meant to be shared. Along with keeping a diary, she wrote many letters, and those to her closest friends she kept private as well. Like other diarists, Martha was involved in a complex literary as well as psychological process. It included issues of what to put in and leave out of her journals, It had to do with who she was writing to and for. It entailed a double consciousness as the self stands apart to view the self. At the point when Martha declared herself finished with diary keeping, she wrote that her intended audience had been her children and grandchildren. She reasoned that given the realization she would never marry, there was little point in continuing with daily writing. Yet for 12 years, her writing had been much more than a means of sharing her life experiences with future generations. It had been a site of construction of self. Through the process of writing, she explored an inner world necessary to sustain the independent course she pursued. Her experience adds to the evidence that the diary shapes the life lived as well as the reverse. The life Martha Schofield lived required great strength and courage. Her health was poor for more than half her life, and at times seemed to portend a premature death. It fueled her desire to be useful, to make her life count for something larger than herself. However, while it may have been a reason to avoid or even postpone marriage, it was not a basis for her to reject it altogether. Her faith in God aided her in accepting whatever might come. Her belief in her ability to discern God's will through the inner light often served to justify her actions when they were at odds with her family or with custom. In that way, as long as she was certain of God's will, she felt justified in her choices. She sought a balance between the love and freedom she needed to pursue the life she desired. She was a woman whose life was centered in the struggle for the emancipation of women and African Americans. That life and that struggle were both constructed and revealed in the pages of her diaries. So she went on. She taught for 4 schools called Seasons, for 4 years on the South Carolina coast until she opened, with her own money, a school in Aiken, South Carolina. In the 3rd year that she was teaching, it's my guess, maybe not guess, but my belief that she actually had tuberculosis, and that's why her health was so precarious for so long. And she had a really severe episode of illness while on Guatemala Island, and nearly died at that point. It was after she recovered that she'd been thinking about it before, but I think that episode really did make clear to her that she wanted to start this school, to be there as long as she could be. Ended up that she was there for a very long time. And again, the interesting thing about her navigating her emotional life, part of what is clear in her diaries, that it was a combination of her relationships with both men and women, the reading that she did, the novels that she read, these other women who were mentors or who were role models for her. All of those worked together, and then just her own will and desire, again, to have a life of usefulness, a life outside the constrictors and bounds of marriage and motherhood, to live on a larger stage, really. And that the fact that she lived at a time when that was possible, that the Civil War was integral to, and its aftermath was integral to her being able to make the choices that she did. So that's what I've been doing. So if you have any questions, let me know. No?
Questions?
Any questions?
Charles, y'all hear me?
Yes.
Do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Bill and I have an observation and a comment.
Yes.
The observation is that when you listen to what Martha said about being willing to devote herself to education,
Yes.
just a minimum amount of support that she expected from the government in exchange for that.
Right.
And it brings to mind what's happening right now.
Yes.
These proposed teacher strikes, in which they're saying that they have been putting up with all this underfunding for years, and it just got to a breaking point
Right.
where they don't even earn enough to support a family.
Right. Well, this is at a time when there was very little support for black education at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, these people like Martha who went down. I mean, she's also among a really small minority. Now I think. So the professor that I work for at UGA, Ron Butchart, who wrote this book about freedom as teachers, called "Schooling the Free People." he's started a database. So at the time that I wrote this, we had approximately 11,000 names. It's now probably more than that. I haven't talked to him recently about how many names are in the databases, but he's always discovering more people. This was not easy research to do. Not very many of the people who taught left diaries like Martha did. And again, she's among a really small minority who made black education, their life work. Most people taught for what was called a season or two. The average was maybe 2 years at most. Some people, part of what he discovered was that far more African Americans were involved in freedmen's education than was thought. This has already been sort of talked about as sort of northern school marms who came south to teach. And some of them did, but there were many other people who were involved. And again, a large number of African Americans, both in the North and the South. And so not only was there not much support for it, but these people put their lives on the line. Teachers were murdered, were killed for what they were doing, especially if they were, out in the hinterlands of, in the South, from 1865 to about 1870. Many of them, if they weren't killed, they were driven off by the Klan and other groups. So, she was really not only to use her own money, but put her life on the line in order to see this happen, which was really difficult for her family. At some point, when she wanted to open the school in Aiken, her sisters said to her, "Look, you've done enough. You couldn't be expected to do any more than you have, so why are you sort of giving your life for these people?" Even though this is a very progressive family, right? Who supported abolition and so on. So anyway, it's a point well taken.
Yes, and if I may, Melanie, comment as a follow-up to that, in my own personal experience, my grandmother, who became of age to teach around the very early part of the 20th century,
Right.
which wasn't very many years after what you were talking about, she told some of us a story about how she wanted to become a teacher, but because of during that time, with your devotion, the level of devotion that you had to make, you either decided to teach or you got married.
That's right. Even
She
then.
decided to get married, which I'm glad she did, because I'm here now.
Right.
But anyway, the thing about it is, I'm very happy that she lived long enough to see me become a teacher.
Right.
And she was very proud of that. And I also just want to comment that my mother was at the forefront of all the struggles that African American teachers had to go through. And I witnessed some of that because I would go to school with her and see some of the things they had to go through.
Yeah. Part of Martha's, she navigated really in some ways pretty brilliantly the social and political terrain of the South, South Carolina while she was there. So her school was both a normal and an industrial school. She was well aware that what the power structure in the South really wanted to train blacks for, or African Americans for, was to be, work, to work, to have some kind of job, So part of what she did, she had a farm as part of her school, so they did pretty interesting sort of experiments with agriculture and so on. But they had a printing shop, shoemaking shop, things where people could learn trades. But at the same time, she was very dedicated to preparing teachers. And in some ways, it almost feels like she was, there was a sort of clandestine sort of feeling about, she was sort of talking about how industrial education was important for blacks in the South, but then she was really working towards training teachers. And she would actually, the first African-American woman to become a doctor in South Carolina was one of Martha's students. She was schooled at the Schofield School, and then Martha paid, and again, she was really good at raising money. She got somebody back in Pennsylvania to support this woman in going to medical school. And then she became a doctor and came back. And actually, she also talked about not marrying, about having a career, and really said that Martha had been her role model.
Powerful. Both my grandmother and grandfather were from Aiken, South Carolina, and they went on to become professors at Morehouse and Spelman. And I know that they were touched by Schofield.
Yeah, I'm sure. It's still, the school, none of the buildings of the school still exist, but there was a public school on the property that's named the Martha Schofield Middle School. I believe it's a middle school. And her house, actually, that she built on the campus is still standing. And it's privately owned now.
Yeah.
It's a shame because there were some, I mean, they were, substantial brick, it was a two city blocks worth of campus. And all that is gone.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other further questions from our WebEx participants or our crowd here?
Here.
Okay. All right. So let's take a 2-minute break and then we'll get set up for our last presentation.
Kevin,
Yes.
Big,
Yes.
Very nicely.
Yes,
done.
Councilman.
Yeah.
okay, during some of Melanie's presentations, okay,
And then
oh,
we
yeah, there it is,
you s-
okay.